Da jeg havde fået dette afskrevet og begyndt at læse, hvad der i grunden stod, kan jeg tydeligt huske, hvordan det isnede i mig. Der stod, dette er de hemmelige ord, som den levende Jesus talte, og som Didymus, Judas, Thomas skrev ned. Fra da af kan jeg roligt sige, at den tekst har fascineret mig. Der har ikke været en dag i hele mit liv, hvor jeg ikke har arbejdet med den på en eller anden måde, eller hvor den har været i mine tanker.
In 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi in the south of Egypt, some peasants made an unusual find. Under a cliff in the desert, they came across a pot which had been carefully sealed. When they opened it, they found a great many ancient manuscripts. The local priest saved the manuscripts from being burned as fuel. They were written in Coptic, the language of the first Christian Egyptians, and they proved to be the greatest find of Christian Coptic texts ever made. One text was an unknown gospel consisting of sayings by Jesus, the Gospel of Thomas. As a young man, the Danish professor Søren Giversen came to play a special role in the history of this sensational find. He has dedicated his life to solving the mystery of the vanished Gospel of Thomas. Did the Gospel genuinely date from the days of Jesus of Nazareth? Did Jesus actually have secret teachings? And how would our church traditions have looked today had the Gospel been accessible?
Jesus said, I shall give you what no eye has seen, and what no ear has heard, and what no hand has touched, and what has never occurred in the human heart.
The Christian church grew rapidly in the first centuries after the death of Jesus. Initially, the disciples passed on his teachings orally. They were not written down till later on, when the stories about his life and work were added. Everything was transcribed, told, and retranscribed for centuries. The biblical text, which became the basis for the church's teachings, emerged over 300 years. Apart from the Old Testament, there were three similar Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the somewhat different Gospel of John, a collection of letters by Paul, setting out the rules of the church, and finally the account of the Acts of the Apostles. Together, these became known as the New Testament. Many manuscripts were not included, though they were still used. Some were accepted by the church for daily use, while others were explicitly forbidden. These were destroyed or hidden away.
Jesus said, a city that is built on a high mountain and fortified cannot fall, nor can it be hidden.
When, in 1945, these rejected Christian texts emerged in Egypt, rumors about the unusual find quickly reached Europe. Many experienced researchers were ready to work on the texts, but the Egyptian authorities were carefully guarding them in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. In 1953, Søren Giversen had just graduated in theology when he spoke to his teacher of church history, Professor Hal Koch.
Og han fortalte mig om det fund, der var gjort i Egypten.
He told me about the discovery of some handwritten texts at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, and he urged me to agree to work on them. I said I didn't even speak the language, but he replied that I could easily learn it. You can be involved in the publication of the text, he told me. I couldn't even dream that such a thing could happen. and I repeated that I didn't know the language. "Things can change," he said.
Hal Koch was right. The Egyptian Revolution of 1952 had made it difficult for foreign researchers to get into the country. Professor Koch immediately started a course in Coptic at Copenhagen University. Søren Giversen threw himself into learning Coptic, although nobody knew if Koch was right, or if Giversen could actually learn Coptic in time to take part in the publication of the texts. Professor Koch arranged for Giversen to study with the greatest researchers in Europe, who would be responsible for the publication of the text. In 1956, the situation in Egypt was calmer, so researchers from France, England, and Holland left for Egypt. In October, they had just arrived in Cairo when the Suez War broke out. They were all expelled. That became the young Danes' great opportunity.
Så fandt han ud af, at
Koch realized that I might be the solution, in that the Egyptians might accept someone from a relatively neutral country not involved in the Suez War. By then I knew the language, and the idea was that I should try to photograph these manuscripts. I was supplied with microfilm equipment bought in Paris, and I went by train to Genoa and sailed via Syracuse and Piraeus to Alexandria, and so finally reached Cairo. There were no connections by air at that time.
The aim was for him to microfilm the manuscripts and send the films back to the eager researchers. But no, the authorities would not give him permission, though he was the only person allowed to work on the texts at the Coptic Museum in Cairo.
They placed a workroom at my disposal right at the top of the building, with a magnificent view over the old town of Cairo and towards the Al-Muqattam mountain. I would sit there and work on the manuscripts, which were spread out on a large table. It was quite an experience for me suddenly to have all these manuscripts that so far I had only heard about. Now here they were, in the original.
In Latin, a book is called a codex. There were 13 books in all. Each was kept in a sort of envelope and written on yellowish-brown papyrus. They were extremely well preserved.
Codex number 2 was the best preserved. It had a cover with an ankh, a cross in the shape of a handle on it. There was a residue of color on the cover. The first pages of the book were damaged, but further in, the pages were for the most part undamaged.
Søren Giversen started at once to transcribe and translate, because he didn't know how long he'd be allowed to stay.
den første tekst, jeg afskrev, var den forreste i det der Codex 2. Det er en tekst, som hedder Johannes' hemmelige lære. Og da jeg var færdig med den, kom jeg ind i en ny tekst, som begyndte på koptisk på den måde, Neine, en schatz, og så videre. Og da jeg havde fået dette afskrevet og begyndt at læse, hvad der i grunden stod, kan jeg tydeligt huske, hvordan det isnede i mig. Der stod, dette er de hemmelige ord, som den levende Jesus talte, og som Didymus, Judas, Thomas skrev ned.
Jesus said, "Recognize what is in your sight, and that which is hidden from you will become plain to you. For nothing that is hidden will not become manifest."
The sayings in the Gospel of Thomas made a strong impression on me. I knew several of these sayings in other forms from the New Testament, and the problem soon arose. What did these words have to do with the New Testament? Were they a transcript of the New Testament? Or were they part of what later became the New Testament. I realized that I was faced with something very meaningful, but also something which at best could become very controversial, but that it could also add new knowledge and new insight.
Giverson was finally given permission to microfilm the texts. The owner of a big Armenian film company offered to process the film for him.
Jeg sad ude hele dagen til den var færdig, og så fik jeg at vide, at jeg kunne afhente den næste dag, så ville den være tør. Jeg var ked af, at jeg ikke kunne få den med hjem. Men så sagde han, der var en udvej, det var, at jeg ikke rullede den sammen, men bare gik med den i hånden. Og så tog jeg sådan 2 film over skulderen, og så gik jeg igennem Kairo et par kilometer. Og pludselig opdagede jeg, at jeg havde sådan en interesseret skare bagefter mig, der ville se, hvad der her skulle foregå. Det var nu ikke det egentlig dramatiske, men det dramatiske, det var, at da jeg så afleverede filmen på museet næste dag, fik jeg at vide, at jeg ikke måtte sende negativerne ud af landet.
But fortunately, Giverson was later allowed to take a copy with him to Europe. He had finally ensured that a copy of the Gospel of Thomas and several old Christian texts were brought safely to Europe. Now he and other researchers around the world had to consider whether the Gospel of Thomas led back to the historical Jesus. Were these truly the words of Jesus?
Jesus said, "Love your brother like your soul. Guard him like the apple of your eye."
Before the discovery, the Gospel of Thomas was only known through the writings of the Church Fathers and from quotations. The text itself was not known. Nevertheless, we knew it had played a significant role. It had been condemned at the Second Church Synod in Nicaea in 787, and right up to the 11th century, it had been attacked in church circles.
But what was it that made the contents of the Gospel of Thomas so controversial?
The Gospel of Thomas consists of 22 pages. And on these 22 pages, there are a series of sayings that are attributed to Jesus. These 114 brief sayings, some of them are slightly longer and also known as parables, these sayings are all called logia. That word actually means a brief word, or what we might call a maxim or aphorism.
Jesus said, "You see the mote in your brother's eye, but you do not see the beam in your own eye. When you cast the beam out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to cast the mote from your brother's eye."
More than half of the Gospel of Thomas is already familiar from the New Testament, especially from the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The rest of Thomas consists of hitherto unknown words of Jesus.
Det, som navnlig gjorde indtryk på mig, det var disse ords enkelhed. Der er ikke et overflødigt ord i den tekst. Man kan næsten mærke det også, selv man kunne læse det gennem en oversættelse. De er talt med myndighed. Den, der har formet dem, ved, hvad det drejer sig om. Ved, hvad det drejer sig om at være menneske.
Central to the Gospel of Thomas are the teachings about the kingdom, the Father's kingdom or God's kingdom. Jesus repeatedly tries to answer the questions. What is this kingdom? Where is it? How do you enter it?
Jesus said, If those who lead you say, "See, the kingdom is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, "It is in the sea," then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside you, and it is outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty.
So the divine is not in the sea or in the sky, but inside people and in front of our eyes, here and now. And one of the conditions for finding it is self-knowledge. That's the radical message from the Gospel of Thomas. As in the New Testament, we should not concern ourselves with outward appearance, and we should cast off all that binds us. According to the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus rejects not only Jewish rules about circumcision, prayer, fasting, the Sabbath, and dietary laws, but all external rules, because they are not what matters. Instead, Jesus makes demands. Heal the sick, he says. Eat what is put before you, because what goes into your mouth will not defile you, but what comes out of it will.
Af Thomas evangeliet kan vi se, at der har været kvinder i disciplekredsen. De spørger, og de får svar på lige fod med de andre disciple. Maria, Salome har været disciple. Og til allersidst i Thomas evangeliet, hvor Peter på mandsjovinistisk vis forsøger at få Maria ligesom deklasseret, afvises det af Jesus. Det er noget nyt for os, at kvinder på lige fod med mænd kan deltage i den disciplebelæring, som der gives af Jesus.
Jesus said, "Two will rest on one couch. One will die, and the other will live." Salome said to him, "Who are you, man, and whose son are you? You have come up onto my couch and eaten from my table." Jesus said to her, "I am he who exists from the undivided. I have been given what was my Father's." Salome said, "I am your disciple." Jesus answered, "Therefore I say that if someone comes who is undivided, he will be filled with light. But if he is divided, he will be filled with darkness."
From the New Testament, we know Salome is one of the women around Jesus. In the Gospel of Thomas, Salome wonders about this man who has been so close to her, who has sat on her couch and eaten at her table, and she declares that she is his disciple. This emphasizes that Jesus' teachings are for everyone, men and women alike. The Gospel of Thomas also mentions Mary Magdalene as a disciple on an equal footing with the men. This is a strong break with the Jewish patriarchal tradition, and also radically different from Paul, who ordered women to be silent in the congregation, and from the Catholic Church, which later turned Mary Magdalene into a whore. But what first strikes the reader about the Gospel of Thomas is everything which is not in it. There are no miracles, no crucifixion, and no Jesus who dies for our sins, no resurrection and no judgment day. There's no Holy Communion and no baptism. And there is not one word about Jesus as the Messiah or Christ. There's no faith and no ritual. In short, everything which is central to the New Testament and the Christian message about Jesus is not there. All we get is the words spoken by Jesus. Are the radical messages in these sayings the explanation of why the Church could not tolerate them? And do they really come from Jesus? Theologians were about to enter a minefield. Here was the Gospel of Thomas, which for centuries had been condemned by the Church, but was now proclaimed by the media as the fifth Gospel. They had good reason to be very thorough.
The first time I saw the manuscript of the Gospel of Thomas, I realized the text had to be very old. The manuscripts were written by a very experienced scribe. It's almost like a type of calligraphy. Based on the shape and type of the letters, it's possible to date a text. And I dated this text to around the 340s, and I said so publicly in 1963. In the beginning of the 1970s, we received a strange confirmation of this when I was with a small group of scientists in Cairo, and we steamed open the binding of one codex, or rather, one of the codices which was also found at Nag Hammadi. We found that the binding had been stiffened with some scraps of papyrus, which probably had been collected from a waste paper basket. On a couple of these scraps, we found dates which corresponded to 341 to 344.
There are signs that the manuscripts of the Gospel of Thomas had belonged to a monastery. They were actually found close to the very first Christian monastery in the world, which was founded in 322 by the Egyptian monk Pachomius. But why had the manuscripts been hidden?
En forklaring på, at disse skrifter, som blev fundet i Nag Hammadi, blev gemt bort, kan være, at det ikke længere var tilladt at bruge dem. I 367 udstedte patriarken Alexander Athanasius den Store et forbud mod at bruge bestemte skrifter til prædiken og til oplæsning i kirken. Og blandt de skrifter, som han nævner, er 2 af dem, som er blevet fundet ved Nag Hammadi. Og så er Thomas evangeliet lidt den skæbne, at det var i samme bind som en af dem. Efter man har fået Athanasius brev, har man måske netop samlet de ting væk, som man skønnede ikke kunne bruges eller ikke måtte bruges, men som man alligevel gerne ville bevare til en bedre, måske gunstigere lejlighed. Og så har man omhyggeligt gemt dem i krukken og forseglet krukken og gemt dem på et sikkert sted. I håb om, at der måske kom en anden orden, når der kom en ny patriark.
This new order never eventuated, and those who knew the secret about the forbidden manuscripts took the secret with them to the grave. So the Gospel of Thomas vanished for almost 2,000 years.
Jesus said, "Whoever believes that the all itself is deficient is himself completely deficient."
When the researchers seemed unable to date the Gospel of Thomas further back than the 4th century, most of them chose to reject it. 2 misconceptions now became dominant among researchers for many years. One view held that the Gospel of Thomas was merely excerpts from the New Testament. The other view was that the Gospel of Thomas stemmed from the Gnostics, because most of the other texts found at Nag Hammadi were Gnostic. The consequence of both views was, rather conveniently, that no one need take the Gospel of Thomas seriously as a source for Jesus and early Christianity. Research was led on a wild goose chase for many years.
Jesus said, "Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all, and he shall find peace."
Fortunately, the Gospel of Thomas was found in a time when interested researchers would ensure the text was published. Søren Giversen published a Danish translation of the Gospel in 1959, then worked on getting all the manuscripts from Nag Hammadi published in facsimile. He was part of the team that made the whole text publicly available in the 1970s. Research into the origins of the texts continued at the same time. This manuscript dates from 340. But when was the text first written down?
The Gospel of Thomas, as we know it from Nag Hammadi, is a transcript. We also know that it was a translation from Greek to Coptic, and that means that there must have been a precursor to the Coptic text.
Around 1900, 3 papyrus rolls written in Greek had been discovered, and it now became clear that they were from the Gospel of Thomas. Søren Giversen dated them to no later than the year 125. The oldest copy of the New Testament in existence comes from the same period. This meant that the Gospel of Thomas definitely existed around the turn of the 1st century. It took a great deal of research to disprove the view that the Gospel of Thomas was a Gnostic text. Søren Giversen became professor of theology at Aarhus University after completing his thesis on John's hidden teachings, one of the Gnostic texts from Nag Hammadi. After long research into early Christianity and the Manichaeans, a Gnostic sect, he was ready to refute the claim that the Gospel of Thomas was a Gnostic text. But who exactly were these Gnostics?
The Gnostics were really only a small group of people who were interested in religion and philosophy, and for whom realization and insight, what is called gnosis in Greek, meant a great deal. But the term Gnosticism means something more. It's a sort of religious philosophical system in which, characteristically, either an evil God has created this world, or it was created by a regrettable mistake, a fall. But certainly not by the will of a good God.
Men det er tydeligt, at i Thomas evangeliet, der spiller sådan noget som erkendelse og viden, og det at vide noget, en vigtig rolle, akkurat som det gør i Johannes evangeliet og også Paulus, men heller ikke på nogen måde mere. Og der er lige så lidt som i Johannes evangeliet og hos Paulus spor af, at det skulle være en ond Gud, der har skabt verden, eller at den skulle være blevet til ved en beklagelig fejltagelse. Det finder man i gnosticismerne, men ikke i Thomas evangeliet.
It was Søren Giversens colleague, the American researcher Helmut Köster, who first disproved the second of the 2 misconceptions, the one which held that the Gospel was only an excerpt from the New Testament.
During the 60s, I began to be interested in this Gospel of Thomas myself and looked at it more closely. And the first thing that struck me was that in the Gospel of Thomas, typical features of the editorial activity of the Gospel writers of the New Testament were missing. That is, in the New Testament we have all the sayings of Jesus included in a biographical framework, which means that the sayings were redacted, the sayings were made subject to a redaction. Looking at the Gospel of Thomas, it struck me that those features are absent.
Jesus said, "No prophet is accepted in his own village. No physician heals those who know him."
There is a saying in the Gospel of Thomas about the prophet who is not accepted in his fatherland and the physician who does not do miracles in his home city. It's a parallel saying in 2 parts. What's the relationship of that saying to the story of Jesus' rejection in Nazareth? Now, already at the beginning of the century, when this particular saying of the Gospel of Thomas became known through a fragment of a Greek papyrus, the argument was made that that saying is more original than the story we have in Mark 6 about Jesus' rejection in Nazareth. What has happened here is that after Jesus is driven out of the city, he says the prophet is not accepted in his fatherland. But what happened to the second part of the saying, the physician doesn't do miracles at home? That has been changed by the author of the Gospel of Mark in narrative, saying, and Jesus did not do many miracles there. So we have the transfer of the saying in two parts, one part quoted, the other part transferred into narrative, which in the development of the tradition is secondary to the saying itself. Whenever you have a parallel, with a very few exceptions, the saying or the parable that occurs in the Gospel of Thomas appears in a more original form than the form that has been given to these sayings and parables by either Matthew or by Luke. So I came to the conclusion, therefore, that this sayings tradition must go back to an independent, older tradition or document which had it was in no way influenced by the Gospel writers.
Both Custer and Giverson think that the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas were written between 50 and 100 AD, in the same period as the New Testament, but without being influenced by it. From changes in the text over time, they conclude that the words of the Gospel of Thomas are older and more original than the corresponding words in the New Testament. That means that more than half the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas are among the earliest recorded words of Jesus, according to some researchers. Take it a step further. The words not known from the New Testament, but preserved in the Gospel of Thomas, why shouldn't they also come from Jesus? Whatever the case, the Gospel of Thomas is an invaluable source of Jesus' teachings and early Christianity. If we take that seriously, it must lead to a revision of our picture of Jesus' teachings and his first followers.
His disciples said to him, "Show us the place where you are, for we must seek it." He said to them, "Whoever has ears, let him hear. There is light within a man of light, and it lights up the whole world. If it does not shine, it is darkness."
Efter min opfattelse, så er Thomas evangeliet et enestående oldkirkeligt dokument, hvis rødder går tilbage til den ældste menighed, som har overleveret disse dyrebare Jesusord, såvel som de har overleveret andre. Og det er fra dem, Thomas evangeliet er kommet videre. Vi ved fra Nytestamentet, at efter det chok, som korsfæstelsesbegivenheden måtte have været for disciplene, der finder de sammen og kommer som en menighed stadigvæk i templet, men samles derudover privat.
We know from the New Testament that in the early church there were differing opinions among the disciples. Soon different interpretations began to crystallize. It was the disciple Peter who first set off with a new message. We also know that Jacob, Jesus' brother, led the church in Jerusalem. Jacob is mentioned in the Gospel of Thomas, a sign that the gospel had a place in that church.
من السماء بأطراف الأربع وقد تحييت فيه فرجل فيه متأملا فرأيت ذو الأربع دبابات كالأرض والوحوش إنك دخلت إلى رجال غلف وأكلت معهم فتفق بطرس على نور من نور إلى حق
الله حق مولود غير مخلوق مساوي الله في الجوهر الذي به كان كل شيء هذا الذي من اجله البشر ومن اجل خلقاتنا نزل من السماء تجسد من روح القدس من المناظرات والنصوص والنار تعلم مخلوقا من الملك يوم السبت من المناظر.
Den ældste menigheds skæbne ved vi lidt om gennem en overlevering hos kirkehistorikeren Euseb fra omkring år 300. Og han fortæller noget om, at kort før romernes belejring af Jerusalem blev fuldstændig, der flyttede den kristne menighed fra Jerusalem over østpå, er gået over Jordan, og så har vandret op mod nord til byen Pella. Og der ved vi, at de har opholdt sig i generationer. Vi kan da næsten sige, hvornår det er, de har udvandret, for det må være før den 21. juni år 68, for der er nået romerne frem til Jericho, og kort derefter har en overgang over Jordan været umulig.
We know that the Christians who used the Gospel of Thomas emigrated to Syria. Other Christians probably brought the Gospel with them to Alexandria. From there it spread along the Nile to Oxyrhynchus and Nag Hammadi, where the Gospel was found. The latest research also shows that the Gospel of Thomas was spread along the Silk Road to India.
Jesus said, "Take heed of the living one while you are alive, lest you die and seek to see him and be unable to do so."
Where the Gospel of Thomas is not influenced by the New Testament, the explanation could be that it was used in isolation from the rest of the Old Church. We can view the Gospels in the New Testament and the Gospel of Thomas as different traditions around the three disciples, Peter, John, and Thomas. We know something of their lives after the death of Jesus. Peter went north after his work in Palestine and ended up in Rome, where he founded what much later became the Catholic Church. According to tradition, John went to Ephesus in what is now Turkey, and the Gospel of John became the main gospel of the Orthodox Church. Thomas traveled east to Syria, Asia Minor, and according to the tradition, on to India. The John tradition became part of the New Testament, not so the Thomas tradition.
These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down.
The Gospel of Thomas is ascribed to Didymus Judas Thomas, who was probably the disciple Thomas, commonly known as Doubting Thomas. But was he?
Det Thomas formentlig er mest kendt for, det ved vi fra kunsten og på anden måde, det er fra slutningen af Johannes evangeliet, hvor Jesus har vist sig for de øvrige disciple, og hvor Thomas ikke har været til stede, og hvor han så klart erklærer, med mindre han selv får lov at konstatere det, vil han ikke tro, at det er en opstand. Og det sker så 8 dage efter, og Jesus viser sig for Thomas, og Thomas bekender sig til ham som min herre og min Gud.
This confession or declaration of faith shows Thomas as the one who was closest to Jesus. And we must remember that Thomas did not at any time act as a doubter. But in the Gospel of John, he is shown as either the one who does not believe or as the one who does.
Jesus said to his disciples, "Compare me to someone and tell me whom I am like. Simon Peter said to him, "You are like a righteous angel." Matthew said to him, "You are like a wise philosopher." Thomas said to him, "Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like." Jesus said, "I am not your master. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated by the bubbling spring which I have tended." And he took Thomas and withdrew, and told him 3 things. When Thomas returned to his companions, they asked him, "What did Jesus say to you?" Thomas said to them, "If I tell you one of the things that he told me, you will pick up stones and throw them at me, but fire will come out of the stones and consume you."
In Logion 13, Thomas is told that he has now learnt so much of Jesus' teachings that Jesus is no longer his master. Thomas has served his apprenticeship. According to Luke, the disciple is not above his master, but everyone who is perfect shall be as his master. There are no known examples of anyone achieving this state, but in Aramaic, Thomas means twin, as does his Greek nickname Didymus. This may mean that Thomas was Jesus' spiritual twin brother. The Gospel of John in the New Testament may point to the nature of the 3 words Jesus said to Thomas.
Thomas asks, in effect, "How are we to follow you when we do not know the way?" And Jesus answers, or rather Jesus says to Thomas, as it is correctly translated, "I am the way, the truth, and the life."
In the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Thomas is only mentioned as among Jesus' disciples. We can imagine that there was jealousy and internal rivalry among the disciples over who was closest to Jesus. This rivalry can be seen in the New Testament, and it may be the reason history has depicted Thomas as the doubter. But the Gospels of Thomas and John tell quite a different story. Thomas is the one who is entrusted to pass on the secret words, the innermost teachings, about the way to the kingdom of God. Words that were preserved for centuries before they were lost. But what would the church have been like today if the Gospel of Thomas had been preserved?
Den kirkelige tradition, vi lever i, ville have været langt rigere, hvis den del af kirken, som samledes som Thomas evangeliet og tilsvarende tekster, havde fået lov at leve, og disse tekster havde fået lov at blive bevaret. Så ville vores kirke have en langt større fornemmelse af betydningen af, hvordan man skal forholde sig til verden. Nå ja, sådan et udtryk som det der er skæsen. Men måske nok det, som det er det egentlige det, en stærkere understregning af det vigtige i at forholde sig her i livet. Det er at vælge mellem det endelige og det uendelige. Det er det, der bestemmer livet.
The sayings of this gospel make it clear how we can take part in the innermost truth, that no research can find, but which can be attained by those who seek the truth.
Jesus said, "Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. I myself shall become him, and the hidden things will be revealed to him."
Jesus says here that if we absorb his teachings as fully as if we drank from his mouth, then we shall become like him. An experience Paul speaks of when he says, "I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me." Everybody can become like Jesus. Everybody has the possibility. But though many may wish to, very few become Jesus. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "Many are around the well, but none is in the spring."
Those are words which become chiseled into one's mind. And the more you work with them and think about them, the more something unfolds. both in terms of imagery and when something is said to us in the form of an appeal. Seek, and ye shall find. And also when we're told that when we find, we shall wonder and become troubled.
The Gospel of Thomas does not, like the New Testament, use the word conversion, but it declares through imagery that a total and radical transformation has to take place.
Jesus saw infants being suckled. He said to his disciples, "These infants being suckled are like those who enter the kingdom." They said to him, "Shall we then enter the kingdom as children?" Jesus said to them, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and above like below, and when you make male and female one and the same, so that male not be male, nor female female, and when you regard an eye in the place of an eye, and a hand in place of a hand, and a foot in place of a foot, and a likeness in place of a likeness, then you will enter the kingdom."
The divided, the male and the female, shall be one, and the outside and inside shall be equal. In honesty and righteousness we must let a hand be a hand, and a foot a foot. Here Jesus is saying that on one hand we must see and acknowledge the world as it is, and on the other hand that we must erase all divisions. We must not evaluate and separate inner and outer, above and below, male and female. This is no pointer to articles of faith, but an instruction, a way into the kingdom of God. It's significant that the word faith, which appears over and over in the New Testament, is not a word that Jesus uses in the Gospel of Thomas. Here it's a question of knowing and of being one with. Faith does not move mountains.
Jesus said, "When you make the two one, you will become the sons of man. And when you say, 'Mountain, move away,' it will move away."
The words of the Gospel of Thomas make big demands. They are not meant for evangelizing. There are no religious rituals to lean on. In the Gospel of Thomas, what matters is existence itself, the here and now.
Jesus said, "Become passers-by."
You can't build a church on existential statements of that kind. The Gospel of Thomas was suitable for study and discussion, and so was used by monks and nuns in the early monasteries until it was banned. The Gospel of Thomas bears witness to an early Christianity that was much more open to interpretation than previously believed, and a tradition that does not stress the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus as its pivotal points. Rather, it emphasizes the words of Jesus as a teacher who imparted divine wisdom. This tradition takes the words of wisdom as an authority in themselves, because the teacher is present in the words he has spoken. Words preserved in the Gospel of Thomas, which we may presume go back to the historical Jesus.
Jesus said, "It is I who am the light which is above all things. It is I who am the all. From me did the all come forth. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up a stone, and you will find me there."
The Gospel of Thomas has, of course, played a vital role in my scientific life. But it has also meant a lot to me in my personal life, the existential. When I've been splitting wood or struggled with some big rocks, I've often thought of Logia number 77. Split a piece of wood and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. What lies behind that is that whatever we do, there is a commitment, because we meet the one who said those words. We are confronted by a choice, and that is really what life is all about. That is what we meet in the Gospel of Thomas.
In the Gospel of Thomas, we meet the innermost of Jesus' teachings, which is also reflected in the New Testament. With its imagery, it reminds us of the innermost teachings of the other great religions, where light, fire, the fountain, and life are images of the ineffable, the divine.
Jesus said, "I have cast fire upon the world, and see, I am guarding it until it blazes."